The sun slowly rose over the wooded ridges of Silver Pine, spreading golden light across the valley like an artist painting a canvas. The air still held the night's chill, but the first rays were already awakening the ranch to life. Somewhere to the west, a faint thunder rumbled like a distant beast growl, but the sky remained clear and serene. Delilah Kincaid stood by the open window of her bedroom, watching as the stables and corrals were bathed in the soft light of dawn. In the distance, near the old oak tree, a black stallion named River stretched upward. His dark coat shimmered, as if absorbing light rather than reflecting it. A majestic and wild creature. With every movement, he radiated untamed power and freedom that Delilah secretly admired. "Delilah, are you going to stare out the window all day or finally help with the horses?" Bo Kincaid, her father, called from somewhere below. His voice was stern and demanding, as always. Bo was a man of few words, but each one carried the weight of years lived and the firmness of someone who relied only on himself. After his wife's death, he took on the entire ranch and raised Delilah, though perhaps not in the way she would have liked. Looking down, Delilah saw him, a wide-brimmed hat hiding part of his face, and calloused hands already inspecting the corral boards, as if searching for flaws. "Coming, Dad?" Delilah called back, hurriedly braiding her hair. The old wooden stairs creaked under her steps, but Delilah barely noticed. She was used to every sound of the house. When she rushed out into the yard, Bo was already tying one of the stallions near the stable. "Check the water troughs," he commanded without looking up, "and stay away from River. That damn horse could hurt you." Delilah, trying to hide her irritation, nodded briefly. She knew her father wasn't just worried for no reason. River was famous for his temper. His former owner, a man with a bad reputation, had left scars and fear on him, turning the beautiful animal into a creature that resembled a furious storm. No attempt to tame him had yet succeeded. However, Delilah saw something more in River. Every movement, every muscle tension told her that beneath the layer of anger lay something else, an unconquered spirit yearning for understanding. "Maybe he just needs time and care," she said cautiously, hoping her father would hear her words. Bo straightened up and finally looked at her. There was no anger in his eyes, but disappointment mixed with concern. "Delilah, not everything can be fixed," he replied slowly. "Some animals are too broken. Understand that." "You're wrong," she whispered softly, but Bo was already engrossed in his work. As she filled the water troughs and spread hay, Delilah couldn't take her eyes off the black stallion. River stood at the edge of the corral, tense and proud, like a guardian of his domain. His eyes, deep and dark, stared into nothingness, but there was a challenge in them. Delilah, unconsciously clenching her fists, decided she wouldn't let this horse remain just a symbol of pain and alienation. "You're not a monster," she muttered, taking a step closer to the corral. River twitched his ear, noticing her presence, but didn't move. It was a tiny step, but it meant a lot to Delilah. From the stable came a soft neigh. It was Fairly, a golden-haired mare and the pride of the ranch. Delilah approached her, running her hand over the smooth neck. "At least you always understand me, right?" she whispered, smiling. Fairly responded with a soft snort, and Delilah, feeling a moment of peace, briefly forgot about all her problems. But the peace didn't last long. Far on the horizon, dark clouds began to gather, spreading across the sky like black blotches. The wind brought the scent of rain and something else, anxiety that wouldn't let go. Delilah looked up, gazing at this sign. Something elusive, something important was approaching, and she couldn't figure out what it was. Perhaps it was at that moment she first felt the whisper of fate, like a harbinger of a storm, hinting to her everything she knew about herself, her family, and this ranch was about to change. By evening, the sky over Silver Pine was tinged with shades of lead, as if nature itself held its breath. The wind picked up, penetrating the cracks of old buildings and making the shutters creak, as if complaining about the approaching storm. Somewhere on the horizon, the first lightning flashed, tearing through the darkness, and a second later, a thunderclap rolled through the valley, shaking everything around. Delilah, standing in the corral, stroked Fairleaf's neck, and looked into the shadows gathering around the pastures. The horses were nervous. Their anxious snorts and the sound of hooves hitting the ground sounded like a warning. A feeling of anxiety, like a snake, crept into her soul, and it wouldn't let go. She tore her gaze from the clouds and headed toward the house, where her father was already standing on the porch. "Bad storm coming," Beau Kincaid said grimly, looking at the sky. His voice was steady, but there was a note of caution in it. He always saw nature as an opponent to be respected but never ignored. "The horses are nervous," Delilah replied softly, approaching him. "Especially River." Beau smirked bitterly and briefly. "He's always nervous. I don't like that horse, Delilah. Be careful." She was about to object, but his words were interrupted by the sudden barking of dogs. Sharp and anxious, it spread through the yard and turned into a long howl. Another followed from a different dog. Delilah tensed and looked at her father, but he had already grabbed a lantern and headed toward the corrals. "Stay here," he called over his shoulder. "Dad, wait!" Delilah shouted, but Beau didn't stop. Everything happened so quickly. A second ago, the yard was empty, and now shadows emerged from the darkness. Tall, indistinct figures moving quickly and silently, like ghosts. The horses roared in fear, breaking away, and the thunder amplified the chaos, deafening with its rumble. "Who's there?" Beau's voice cut through the night, and Delilah saw him raise the lantern, illuminating the corral. There, among the horses, were strangers with ropes and whips. One of them was already leading fairly, her golden silhouette standing out even in the darkness. The horse desperately resisted, her hooves kicking up mud, but the man yanked the rope so hard she stumbled. "Hey, get your hands off her!" Beau roared, stepping forward. In the next second, he was knocked to the ground. One of the men swung a heavy stick at his shoulder, and Beau crashed into the mud, gasping for breath. "Dad!" Delilah screamed, rushing to him. She didn't make it. Someone grabbed her shoulder and pushed her back. She fell, painfully hitting her elbow on the ground. Through the haze of fear and adrenaline, she saw the strangers herding the horses into a truck, their shadows merging with the darkness. River, standing at the other end of the corral, furiously pawed the ground, his neighing filled with wild fury. But no one dared approach him. Delilah, gritting her teeth, stood up and screamed with all her might. "Get out of here! These are our horses!" Her voice was hoarse and trembling, but she didn't back down. One of the men turned around, his face briefly illuminated by a flash of lightning, dark eyes, a mocking smirk. He said nothing, just waved to the others. The truck roared, and the wheels, spinning in the mud, took off. Delilah saw Fairly, her beloved horse, struggling inside the truck, and the shadows of other animals flailing around her. The last thing she noticed was River. He stood motionless, like a statue, but his eyes burned with fire. The tires left deep tracks in the ground, which the rain quickly turned into a mess. Delilah rushed to her father, who was trying to get up, leaning on his elbows. "Dad, are you okay?" Her voice broke into a rasp. Beau grimaced, clutching his shoulder. His eyes, usually so firm, were filled with pain and anger. "They took them, Delilah. The horses. I'll bring them back," she whispered. In her words, there was no doubt, only determination, awakened along with hatred for those who dared to take what was sacred to them. The rain intensified, pounding on the roof of the house and fences, as if nature itself mourned the loss. In the lantern light, Delilah looked at the corral, now missing half the horses. Only River still stood there, in the far corner. His dark silhouette stood out against the lightning, and Delilah thought she saw something in his gaze that others couldn't notice. Not anger, but a promise. And she knew this was only the beginning. Dense fog settled over Silver Pine early in the morning, as if trying to hide the traces of yesterday's nightmare. The rain had finally stopped, but it left behind soggy mud and deep tire tracks leading from the stables to the fences. The air was filled with moisture and an unsettling silence, unusual for a ranch where the rhythmic sound of hooves and the soft neighing of horses always echoed. Delilah stood by the corrals, looking at the gaping void where her beloved horses had grazed just yesterday. The emptiness now reminded her of a fresh, aching wound. Fairly and the other horses were gone, as if they had never existed. Only River, proud and silent, still stood at the far fence. His gaze was piercing, like a January wind, and his mane was tousled from the night storm. "Delilah, come here," Beau's hoarse voice called. He stood on the porch, leaning on a stick he seemed to have found in the shed. His right arm was tightly bandaged, and his gaze was darker than the night sky. Beau was one of those people who considered pain a part of life, not a reason to stop. Delilah reluctantly approached him. "I can't work today," he said sharply, as if ashamed of this admission. "You'll have to manage with what's left." The girl nodded, waiting for more. But instead of words, Beau handed her an old suede whip, with worn leather strips running along it. "This was Mom's," he said gruffly. "She always said horses can't be subdued by force, only by trust." Delilah clutched the whip in her fingers, feeling the warmth of memories, as if the object itself held echoes of her mother's voice. She cautiously asked, "You know I won't give up, right?" Beau looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, there was a spark in his eyes that she couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps it was pride, hidden behind a mask of fatigue. "Don't you dare break, Delilah," was all he said. From that day on, Delilah almost lived in the corral with River. Each new day became a battle for them, not just physical, but moral as well. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, standing at the edge of the fence. River raised his head, his ears twitched, but he didn't move. She took step after step, approaching the stallion. Each step was like walking on a knife's edge. Too quick a movement, and he would rear up again. She didn't rush, keeping her hands lowered and her voice calm and steady. "I know you think all people are the same, but I won't hurt you," she whispered when only a few steps remained between them. River froze, his breathing heavy and rapid. The girl, holding her breath, extended her palm, leaving it open. Finally, after long minutes of tense waiting, the stallion twitched slightly forward, his nostrils closing around her fingers, sniffing them with distrust. "That's a good boy," Delilah said, smiling through the relief that washed over her. This moment was their first bridge of trust. Though fragile as ice on a pond, it was real. At night, under the dim light of the moon, Delilah sat on an old log by the corral. Her gaze wandered over the starry sky, and her thoughts gave her no peace. Somewhere out there, among the hills and wastelands of Colorado, were Fairly and the others. She couldn't forget their gazes, full of fear when strange hands pulled them away. "I'll bring you back," she whispered, clenching her fingers into a fist. Behind her came the sound of footsteps. Delilah started and turned around. At the edge of the lantern light stood River. His dark silhouette almost blended with the night shadow. He looked at her just as intently as he had on the night of the kidnapping, as if understanding her thoughts. "Seems like you're just as stubborn as I am." Delilah smiled, standing up. She approached him, and the stallion didn't move. Instead, he slowly lowered his head, as if in silent agreement. "Tomorrow will start for real," she promised. At that moment, she knew River would be not just her ally. He was her chance, her weapon, and her last hope to return what rightfully belonged to her and her family. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed was even more ominous. It foretold a new battle, a fight she prepared for with each new day. Morning fog hung over Silver Pine like a cold, milky sea, spreading across the pastures and corral. Delilah led River out of the stable onto the empty field behind the ranch. Dew covered the grass like wet beads, and each step the stallion took left deep imprints behind. His breath came out in clouds of steam, and his eyes, full of wild fire, watched Delilah's every move. "Today, everything changes, River," she whispered, stroking his powerful neck. Just yesterday, he had allowed her to approach him, but that wasn't enough. She needed not just his fear and respect. She needed his trust. Only then could they become one. She threw a light blanket over his back and, holding the reins loosely, allowed him to get used to the unfamiliar weight. River tensed, his muscles twitching, but Delilah made no sudden movements. She stood beside him, whispering soothing words, her voice as soft as the morning wind. "I know it's not easy for you, but I'm scared too," she whispered. River raised his head, and a shadow of understanding flashed in his dark eyes. The day dragged on agonizingly. Delilah and River circled the field. She gradually shortened the distance, carefully teaching him to respond to gentle commands. Sometimes he patiently followed her, but the next moment, breaking away, he would race around, kicking up clods of earth. In such moments, Delilah would freeze, allowing him to vent his anger and fear. She didn't scold or reprimand. She just waited. "Good job, big guy," she said when River, after a long run, stopped and turned his head toward her. Sweat glistened on his flanks, his breathing was heavy, but there was no anger in his gaze. Only fatigue and something new, a reluctance to run away. Just like that, she exhaled, taking another step. She slowly reached out her hand and touched his neck. River flinched, but didn't back away. At that moment, something broke. The invisible barrier between them crumbled. Delilah knew it. By evening, her father came out onto the porch and watched them. He stood leaning against the wooden frame, his face hidden in shadow, but Delilah felt his gaze. "Are you still sure this isn't a lost cause?" Bo finally said. Delilah, not taking her eyes off River, replied calmly. "He's not broken, Dad. He just didn't know what it means to trust." Bo smirked, but there was no usual sarcasm in his voice. "And do you think you can bring him to the end?" "I can, because if not me, then who?" Bo said nothing, just turned away and slowly returned to the house, leaving Delilah alone in the cold wind. She looked at River. The stallion stood at the very edge of the corral, his mane fluttering, his gaze fixed on her. "We'll make it," she whispered, gripping the reins in her hand. The next few days were a real test for Delilah. She and River learned from each other, step by step closing the distance between trust and fear. Delilah didn't rush, even when her father watched her with disapproval. She knew harshness wouldn't help, only patience, of which she always had plenty. One morning, after another training session, she noticed something strange in the mud, a deep boot print that didn't belong to any of the ranch workers. Delilah frowned and slowly ran her finger along the track. "These aren't ours," she muttered to herself. She looked up, her heart racing. The wind carried a distant, barely audible sound of an engine, and on the horizon, where the trail disappeared into the forest, a dark spot flashed. Delilah approached River, his eyes already following the road. The stallion, like her, sensed danger. She stroked his neck, her voice firm but trembling with excitement. "Looks like it's time to find out what we're capable of." She grabbed an old saddle, worn but still sturdy, and began strapping it to River's back. The stallion tensed, but this time he didn't try to run away. His nostrils flared, and his breathing was heavy, as if before a battle. "I know you're scared. So am I. But we have to do this now. Together." At the last moment, she glanced at the house, where her father's silhouette flashed in the window. Bo watched her, but didn't stop her. Delilah sighed and jumped into the saddle. River made a sharp jerk, but the girl squeezed her knees and held on. "Forward, River," she shouted. The stallion broke away, his hooves thundering on the wet ground, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Delilah leaned forward, feeling the wind whipping her face, but she only smiled. She and River were no longer strangers. They were one. The trail led them deeper into the forest. The sound of the engine faded ahead, and the shadows of the trees seemed longer and more ominous. But Delilah didn't stop. She knew. Somewhere out there were her horses, her Fairly, and she wouldn't let them be lost. Under the cover of the trees, Delilah pulled on the reins, and they stopped. Before them, behind the trees, were the remains of a camp, ashes of a fire, ropes, and hoof prints. Delilah stepped forward. She carefully touched the rope, and a spark of hope ignited in her heart. "They're close, River. I can feel it." The stallion snorted, as if agreeing. Delilah looked up at the sunset sky, which shimmered with crimson and orange hues, and whispered, "We'll bring them back. I promise." Sunset spread bloody hues over Silver Pine, plunging the forest and wastelands into anxious twilight. Long shadows of trees seemed alive, as if trying to hide something from view. Delilah, crouching by the hoof prints and campfire remains, scrutinized every sign on the ground like a hunter tracking prey. They were here, those who took her fairly and the other horses. A rope, dropped in haste, an ember still smoldering in the grass spoke of one thing. The kidnappers were close. River stood nearby, his dark silhouette blending with the forest shadows. His nostrils flared, catching the air, and his ears twitched, picking up every sound. He was on alert, just like Delilah. "Shaboy, we need to be smarter than them," she whispered, standing up. The sun had completely set, yielding to darkness. Delilah knew that the night would be their ally, but also their most dangerous opponent. The thieves couldn't be caught off guard if they acted carelessly. She returned to River, running her hand over his neck, feeling the warmth of living strength under her fingers. This stallion was her support, and she trusted him as much as he was beginning to trust her. "Ready?" she asked, tightening the reins. River responded with a sharp snort, as if understanding that something important lay ahead. Delilah jumped into the saddle, her heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in the night silence. They moved quickly but quietly, skirting dense thickets and maneuvering between trees. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting silvery streaks on their path. The sounds of the night, the creaking of branches, the distant cry of an owl, grew quieter as they approached the kidnappers' hideout. When Delilah heard muffled voices and the clatter of horses' hooves, she pulled on the reins, forcing River to freeze. Thickening fog shrouded the forest gorge, hiding their presence. Delilah dismounted and, leaving River in the cover, crept closer. From behind the trees, a view of the kidnappers' camp opened up. Several men were sitting by the fire, bottles passing from hand to hand, their rough voices sounding lazy and careless. Off to the side, behind a crude fence, the horses huddled, among which Delilah immediately spotted Fairleaf's golden mane. "I found you, girl," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. But there was no time for reflection. Delilah knew that a frontal attack would be foolish. It would be stupidity. They needed to create chaos to distract the men and give the horses a chance to escape. She returned to River, firmly grasping his reins, and looked him in the eyes. "Listen, River. I need you to cause them real trouble. You can do it, I know." River snorted, as if accepting the command. Delilah took a deep breath and, throwing the reins over the stallion's neck, patted his rump. "Go, boy. Show them who's the real storm here." River lunged forward, his hooves thunderously disrupting the night's silence. He burst into the camp like a dark hurricane, overturning barrels, scattering the fire, and sowing chaos among the men. The horses in the corral reared up, their neighing filling the air with panic and fear. "What the hell?" the thieves' cries rang out. Delilah didn't waste time. While the men tried to catch the rampaging River, she crept up to the corral. Fairly's bright gaze met hers, and hope surged in the girl's chest. "Easy, girl. I'll set you free," she whispered, working her fingers over the heavy lock. The lock yielded with a soft click, and Delilah, without hesitation, swung the gate open. The horses, sensing freedom, rushed forward, scattering the fence. Fairly, finding herself next to Delilah, snorted and dashed off with the others. "Go on, go!" Delilah shouted, waving her hand. But her plan was far from complete. One of the men spotted her, and his rough voice echoed over the camp. "Girl, she's letting them out." Delilah felt a chill of fear run down her spine. But then, out of the darkness, River emerged dark, elusive, like the night itself. He stopped next to her and waited, his gaze burning with anticipation. "Let's go," Delilah shouted, jumping onto his back. River took off, and behind them echoed shouts and the sound of running feet. The horses followed them, like a single herd, driving the kidnappers away and disappearing into the night. Far in the distance, the lights of Silver Pine Ranch came into view. Delilah leaned forward, holding onto River's neck, and he didn't slow down, as if understanding the importance of their mission. The forest flashed by in dark shadows, branches whipping at her legs, but the fear dissolved in the whirlwind of freedom and determination. When they finally reached the ranch, Bo rushed out onto the porch with a lantern in hand, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Delilah on River, leading a herd of horses. Delilah, in his voice was a mix of concern and pride. The horses stormed into the yard, kicking up clouds of dust. Delilah pulled on the reins, stopping River right by the corral fence. "We brought them back, Dad," she said, breathing heavily, her voice filled with victory. Bo stepped down from the porch, his gaze sweeping over the horses, then resting on his daughter and River. Pride, unhidden by words, shone in his eyes. "You did it, Delilah," he said softly. The girl, dismounting, hugged River's neck and whispered, "You were magnificent, boy. I knew we could do it." The wind carried the last echoes of the night, taking away fear and anxiety. Now, peace and life had returned to Silver Pine. Dawn of Hope night gave way to the first light of morning. Above Silver Pine, the sky slowly brightened, painting the horizon in soft shades of pink and gold. The fog dissipated, as if yielding to a new chapter, a new life. The horses in the corral grazed peacefully, their shadows stretching across the damp ground. Among them towered Fairly, her golden mane shimmering in the rising sun, and beside her, like a black lightning bolt, stood River, his stance proud and calm. Delilah stood leaning against the wooden fence, watching them. For the first time in many days, peace reigned in her heart. She felt that everything she had gone through was finally worth it. "You did it." Her father's voice sounded unexpectedly, but not harshly. Bo Kincaid approached her, his steps heavy but confident. He stopped next to her and placed his calloused hand on her shoulder. Delilah looked up at him, her gaze filled with pride and fatigue. "You didn't believe in me, Dad," she said softly, without reproach. Bo looked out at the field where the rescued horses had regained their freedom. His eyes, usually so stern and impenetrable, now softened. "I was just afraid. Afraid that this world would break you like it broke others. But you turned out to be stronger. Much stronger than I could have imagined." Delilah smiled, and it was a smile filled not only with joy, but also with deep gratitude. "I learned this from you, Dad, and from Mom. She would be proud of us, right?" Bo nodded, turning away to hide the gleam in his eyes. "Yes, she always believed in the strength of your heart." The day at the ranch began with the usual bustle. Workers bustled around the corral, checking the horses and repairing the fences damaged by the night's events. Neighbors, hearing about the return of the horses, began to arrive, some with food, some with tools, and others just with warm words of support. "You're a real heroine, Delilah," said Mrs. Watson, the old lady from the neighboring house, handing her a basket of pies. "Few would dare to do what you did." "Thank you, Mrs. Watson. But I wasn't alone." Delilah looked at River, who stood calmly by the stable. "He helped me. He was my friend and ally." River, as if hearing her words, raised his head and looked at her. In his gaze, there was no longer wild fear, only calmness and trust. Delilah approached him and gently stroked his neck. "You've changed, boy. Or maybe we both have." At noon, police officers arrived at the ranch. An officer with a square jaw, whom Bo shook hands with, approached Delilah and looked at her intently. "Good job, Miss Kincaid. Thanks to you and your horses, we were able to catch those people. Serious charges have been brought against them." Delilah nodded, feeling the last weight lift from her shoulders. "They won't hurt anyone else. That's what matters." The officer smiled and extended his hand. "The town is proud of you, Delilah. Not everyone is capable of such an act." She shook his hand and then looked at her father, who stood a little apart and watched her. In his gaze, there was no longer any doubt or fear, only belief and pride. "You've earned your place here, Delilah," Bo said later that evening as they sat on the porch. "This is your home now, no less than mine." "It always was, Dad," she replied softly, looking at the pastures bathed in sunset light. When night fell over Silver Pine, Delilah went out to the corral again. The horses dozed peacefully under the starlit sky, and only River still stood at the far end, his dark silhouette outlined against the lightning. She approached him, her steps almost silent on the soft ground. "Thank you for not leaving me," she whispered, looking at her black friend. River softly snorted and lowered his head to her shoulder, as if replying, "You didn't leave me either." Delilah looked up at the sky, where the stars shone brightly. Somewhere out there, among that endless night canvas, she knew her mom was looking down at them and smiling. "We did it, Mom," she whispered, and the silent, peaceful, and soothing silence was her answer. Years later, the name Delilah Kincaid would be passed from mouth to mouth among the residents of Silver Pine. They would tell the story of the brave girl who dared to stand against danger and bring back what belonged to her family. But for Delilah herself, it was not a story of heroism. It was a story of trust, love, and how two stubborn hearts, a human's and a horse's, found a common language and together overcame darkness. And on the pastures of Silver Pine, under the light of the rising sun, the sound of hoofbeats and the soft neighing of horses who had found their home again would always be heard.